Adjusting throttle slightly for descent.
Welcome back to our channel. Today's story is about a flight that seemed completely routine, but it ended up turning back. The aircraft pushed back from the gate on time, its movement guided by painted lines that thousands of wheels had followed before. Nothing about the morning felt unusual. Weather was stable. Visibility was clear. The runway inspection had been completed earlier, and the dispatch release showed no open technical items. To most of the passengers, this flight was just another routine crossing between two familiar cities. People adjusted headrests, silenced phones, and settled into the quiet expectation of arrival. In the cockpit, the captain reviewed the departure briefing without urgency. Fuel numbers matched the plan. Weight and balance were well within limits. The first officer monitored the displays, cross-checking values that rarely changed from flight to flight. The aircraft's systems hummed with the same restrained precision they always did. There was no reason to think this flight would be remembered. Takeoff was smooth. Acceleration felt normal. Rotation came at the expected speed, and the aircraft lifted cleanly into the air. As the city fell away beneath the wings, the crew engaged the autopilot and began the standard climb profile. Cabin crew started their initial checks. Passengers relaxed, some opening laptops, others closing their eyes. The flight settled into its rhythm. At around 10,000 feet, a minor advisory appeared briefly on one of the engine monitoring pages. It did not trigger a warning tone. It did not illuminate any master caution lights. It was the kind of line that could be missed if someone blinked at the wrong moment. The first officer noticed it, paused, then watched it disappear. He said nothing immediately. The parameter had returned to normal. Fluctuations happened. Sensors were not perfect. The checklist logic did not demand action. Still, he marked the moment mentally, the way experienced pilots do, storing it away without attaching emotion to it. The climb continued. Air traffic control cleared the aircraft to a higher altitude. The engine readings remained stable. Fuel flow was balanced. Cabin pressure rose predictably. If anyone had been recording the flight from the outside, there would have been nothing to comment on. A clean climb, a stable aircraft, a routine operation. 15 minutes later, another small irregularity appeared, this time on a different page. Again, it resolved itself within seconds. No limits were exceeded, no alerts were triggered. The captain glanced over, not because the system demanded attention, but because habit told him to look when a display changed unexpectedly. He saw normal values and looked away again. Neither pilot spoke about it right away. Silence in the cockpit is not unusual. It often means everything is exactly as expected. The aircraft leveled off at cruise altitude. The engines reduced power slightly, settling into their long, steady workload. Outside, the sky was pale and empty, broken only by thin layers of cloud far below. Inside, the cabin lights dimmed. Drinks were served. Conversations softened. It was during this phase, when workload was lowest, that the captain felt something he could not easily describe. There was no alarm, no vibration, no noise. Just a sense that the flight was not as settled as it should have been. He checked the instruments again. All readings were within normal ranges. He checked the navigation display. The route was correct. He checked the fuel prediction. On target. The feeling did not come from any single indication. It came from the absence of certainty. The captain had been flying long enough to know the difference between anxiety and awareness. Anxiety is loud. It demands attention. Awareness is quiet. It simply waits. He asked the first officer to pull up the engine trend data. This was not a required action. It was a discretionary one. The data showed nothing dramatic. A slight deviation here, a minor variation there, all well inside acceptable margins. They compared notes. The first officer mentioned the earlier advisory. The captain nodded. He had seen it too. Neither could point to a rule that justified concern. There was no checklist for discomfort, no procedure for a feeling. They continued monitoring. As the flight progressed, the sense did not fade. It did not intensify either. It remained steady, like a low-pressure system that never fully formed. The captain reviewed the options silently. Continuing the flight was completely justified. Turning back would inconvenience hundreds of people and disrupt schedules. Across the network, there would be questions. There always were. He requested a brief hold from air traffic control, citing operational reasons. The aircraft flew a wide arc in the sky while the crew reviewed data again. Everything still appeared normal. In the cabin, passengers noticed nothing unusual. A gentle turn was not uncommon. The seatbelt sign remained off. The atmosphere stayed calm. After the hold, the captain made a decision that could not be explained by numbers alone. He informed control that the flight would be returning to the departure airport as a precaution. No emergency was declared. No technical failure was reported. The words were carefully chosen. The aircraft turned back toward the runway it had left less than an hour earlier. When the announcement came, it was brief and measured. A precautionary return. No danger. Safety as a priority. Some passengers sighed. Others checked watches. A few rolled their eyes. To them, nothing had happened. The aircraft landed without incident. Taxiing back to the gate felt almost surreal. Engines that had performed flawlessly moments earlier shut down quietly. The doors opened. The flight ended where it had begun. At that moment, there was still no evidence that the decision had mattered at all. Once the passengers had disembarked, the aircraft stood alone at the gate, silent and unremarkable. To anyone passing through the terminal, it looked no different from dozens of others parked along the concourse. There were no emergency vehicles, no flashing lights, no visible signs that anything had gone wrong. The return had been quiet, procedural, and deliberately understated. Inside the cockpit, maintenance personnel arrived with tablets and headsets. The captain and first officer remained to brief them, careful to describe events precisely as they had occurred. No warnings, no exceedances, only two brief advisories that resolved themselves and a sense that the aircraft had not been behaving exactly as expected. The lead engineer listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking for a specific timestamp. They began with the basics. Power was reapplied to the aircraft and the systems were brought back online. Built-in tests ran automatically, checking computers, sensors, and control units. The results came back clean. No faults recorded, no messages stored. According to the aircraft, nothing had happened. The engineers moved on to manual inspections. Engine panels were opened. Fluid levels were checked. Filters were examined for contamination. Everything appeared normal. The engines showed no visible damage, no signs of overheating, no leaks. The aircraft's maintenance history was reviewed. Recent checks had been completed on schedule. No recurring defects stood out. For a moment, it seemed possible that the flight would be logged as an uneventful precautionary return, closed without findings and forgotten within days. That outcome would not have been unusual. Still, the captain remained nearby. He did not interfere, but he did not leave either. Experience had taught him that the absence of evidence did not always mean the absence of a problem. Sometimes it meant the problem had not yet revealed itself. Data analysts joined the process remotely. The flight data recorder information was downloaded, not because of an incident, but because the captain requested it. The dataset was large, capturing thousands of parameters every second. Most of it would show exactly what everyone already expected. Stable flight, normal systems, routine operation. Hours passed, shift changes occurred. The aircraft remained grounded, officially for inspection. Unofficially because no one felt comfortable clearing it just yet. Late in the afternoon, a junior engineer noticed something that did not quite align. It was not a failure, not even an exceedance. It was a pattern. During the climb phase, one engine's exhaust gas temperature showed a brief lag relative to fuel flow changes. The delay was minimal, fractions of a second, and well within certified limits. On its own, it meant nothing. But when the same pattern appeared again during cruise, and then once more during the holding turn, it became harder to dismiss. The data points were small, but they repeated. The engineer flagged it for review. Senior staff examined the trend more closely. Similar aircraft were queried from the fleet database. Most showed clean correlations between fuel input and temperature response. A few showed slight variations. None matched this aircraft exactly. The finding was still not enough to ground the airplane permanently. Aircraft are designed with margins precisely because perfect symmetry does not exist. Yet the repetition raised questions. Why now? Why this engine? Why this flight? Further analysis expanded beyond the engine itself. Air data sensors were checked. Environmental control systems were reviewed. Electrical loads during climb were compared to baseline values. Slowly, a broader picture began to form. though it was incomplete and frustratingly subtle. By evening, the initial confidence that nothing would be found had faded. The aircraft was not declared unsafe, but it was no longer considered routine. The captain was informed of the ongoing review. He listened quietly, offering no commentary beyond answering direct questions. He did not say that he felt vindicated. He did not need to. The fact that the aircraft remained under scrutiny was enough. Overnight, a deeper diagnostic was authorized. This was not common for a flight with no warnings, but it was not unprecedented either. The aircraft systems were designed to record far more than what pilots ever see on their displays. The challenge was knowing where to look. In the early hours of the morning, analysts focused on a component rarely discussed outside technical circles, a control unit responsible for modulating engine response during transitional phases of flight. It was a small box buried deep within the system architecture, designed to smooth inputs and prevent abrupt changes. It was redundant, backed up by parallel logic, and highly reliable. Its data showed something unusual. During moments when engine demand shifted rapidly, the unit introduced a micro delay before stabilizing output. The delay was brief and automatically corrected, which explained why no warnings appeared. However, under specific conditions, those delays aligned with changes elsewhere in the system, creating a temporary mismatch between commanded and actual engine behavior. The margins were still safe. The aircraft was not in danger during this flight, but simulations suggested that under a different combination of weight, temperature, and altitude, the mismatch could have escalated into something far more serious. The room grew quiet as the implication settled. What the captain had sensed was not a fault that existed yet. It was a path toward one. The aircraft remained parked. Notifications were sent quietly within the airline. No public statements were made. There was still more to confirm, more data to review. But the direction was clear now. The decision to turn back had not solved a problem. It had interrupted its development. Center of attention inside the airline's technical operations division, it still sat at the same gate. Power occasionally connected, doors closed, unremarkable to anyone outside the process. Inside meeting rooms and data labs, however, its flight was being replayed second by second. The control unit identified earlier was removed and replaced with a known serviceable unit. That alone did not explain why the anomaly had appeared now. Components do not usually change behavior without reason. Engineers needed to understand whether the unit itself was failing or whether it had been reacting to something else in the system. Bench testing began immediately. Under standard conditions, the removed unit performed exactly as designed. Response times were within specification. Redundant logic switched correctly. No faults were recorded. If tested in isolation, it would have passed without comment. This result complicated the picture. Attention shifted back to the aircraft's environment during the flight. Analysts reconstructed conditions as accurately as possible. Ambient temperature, climb profile, engine bleed usage, electrical demand, aircraft weight. Each variable was adjusted in simulations to see how the system responded. Most combinations produced nothing unusual. Late in the afternoon, a senior engineer suggested reviewing data from earlier flights of the same aircraft, not just recent ones. The idea was simple. If the pattern had appeared before, it might have been ignored because nothing followed from it. Historical data was pulled. At first glance, earlier flights looked normal. No returns, no write-ups, no reports from crews. But when the same narrow parameters were applied, faint echoes of the same delay appeared. Months apart, never consistent, always brief, always corrected automatically. The pattern had existed quietly, never reaching a threshold that demanded attention. The question was no longer whether the anomaly was real. It was why it had remained harmless until now. A cross-functional review was scheduled. Pilots, engineers, safety analysts, and dispatch representatives gathered around shared screens. The captain who had turned the aircraft back attended, not as a central figure but as a witness. He listened as others discussed models and margins. When asked to describe his experience again, he used the same careful words as before. Nothing specific, just a sense of misalignment. Someone mentioned coincidence. Someone else mentioned intuition. Both terms were set aside. The group focused instead on systems. During the review, one analyst highlighted a subtle correlation. On the day of the flight, electrical demand during climb had been slightly higher than average. Not enough to trigger any alerts, The cause was ordinary. Additional cabin systems running longer due to ground delays earlier that morning. Higher electrical demand increased load on certain power distribution paths. Those paths, in turn, interacted with the control unit's timing logic. The effect was tiny, but it existed. When combined with the specific climb profile flown that day, the timing offsets aligned. Simulations were updated to reflect this interaction. This time, the results changed. Under specific conditions, the system no longer corrected the delay smoothly. Instead, it oscillated briefly before stabilizing. The oscillation was short, but it propagated into other parameters, including engine vibration data. The room went quiet again. This was still not a failure. The aircraft remained within certified limits, but certification assumes independence between certain systems. Here, that independence had eroded just enough to matter. The safety team began constructing a scenario tree. Most branches ended harmlessly. A few did not. In those branches, the oscillation coincided with turbulence or a rapid thrust change, pushing the system closer to protective limits. Automatic protections would likely engage, but their timing was not guaranteed. The conclusion was careful, precise, and unsettling. The aircraft had not been unsafe. It had been becoming unsafe. A fleet-wide review was initiated discreetly. Other aircraft with similar configurations were checked for the same interaction. Minor software differences explained why the pattern was rare. This aircraft happened to sit at an intersection of variables. The captain was informed of the findings. He did not react outwardly. There was no satisfaction in being correct. He simply asked whether the aircraft would have completed the flight safely. The answer was honest. Probably. Probably was not the same as certainly. Regulatory authorities were notified through established channels. Not as an emergency, as a safety trend. Documentation was precise. Language was measured. No dramatic conclusions were drawn. The control unit software was scheduled for revision. The update would slightly alter timing logic, increasing separation between interacting systems. The change would be invisible to crews. Flights would continue as normal. To passengers, nothing would ever be known. Internally, the event became a case study, not because of what happened, but because of what did not. A return based on incomplete information had prevented a sequence from continuing long enough to reveal its full shape. The captain returned to regular duty. The aircraft returned to service weeks later, indistinguishable from before. Schedules resumed. Logs were closed. Yet within the organization, the flight was remembered quietly, not as a near miss, not as a hero story, as an example of how complex systems fail slowly, and how human judgment, when it interrupts that process early enough, can change outcomes without ever being noticed. The flight that turned back never made headlines, but it changed procedures, software, and assumptions. And that was enough. The software update entered the fleet quietly, folded into a routine maintenance cycle that attracted little attention. No bulletins were issued to passengers. No press releases were written. For flight crews, the change appeared as a single line in technical documentation, briefly noting an optimization in engine, response logic under specific transitional conditions. Most would never read beyond the headline. The aircraft that had turned back was among the first to receive the update. When it returned to service, its first flight followed the same route as the one it had abandoned weeks earlier. The weather was similar. The load was comparable. The climb profile matched the original within narrow tolerances. This time, nothing unusual occurred. Engine parameters tracked cleanly. Timing correlations aligned as expected. The subtle oscillations seen in simulations never appeared. The aircraft completed the flight uneventfully and landed on schedule. To the passengers on board, it was just another routine trip. Inside the airline, the incident file was closed with a final summary. It described a confluence of minor factors, none of which would have justified action on their own. Together, they had created a narrow window of risk, one that existed briefly and then disappeared when the sequence was interrupted. The language was careful. There was no claim that an accident had been prevented. Aviation safety does not deal in certainties about futures that never happened. Instead, the report stated that an emerging hazard had been identified and mitigated. That was enough. The captain read the final document days later. He recognized the flight numbers, the timestamps, the data points. He recognized himself only indirectly, referred to as the operating crew. There was no mention of instinct or intuition, only a decision made in the absence of clear fault indications. He accepted that framing without objection. In aviation, actions matter more than narratives. Months passed. The case faded from daily conversation. New issues demanded attention. New flights came and went. The aircraft accumulated hours, cycles, and landings, each one indistinguishable from the next. Yet the change rippled outward in ways that were difficult to trace. Training departments updated scenario discussions, emphasizing the value of trend awareness over strict alert dependence. Engineers revised internal review triggers, lowering thresholds for pattern-based analysis. Safety teams adjusted how they categorized precautionary returns. None of these changes referenced a single flight explicitly. They did not need to. Elsewhere, in data centers shared across manufacturers and regulators, aggregated information from multiple operators began to reflect similar micro-patterns. Not failures, signals. The kind that only become visible when enough quiet data points are placed side by side. The industry's understanding shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. No one outside those circles noticed. The passengers from the original flight moved on immediately. Some were rebooked, some arrived late. A few complained. None followed up weeks later to ask what had been found. There was no reason to. From their perspective, the return had been unnecessary. That perception was not incorrect. It was incomplete. Safety in complex systems is often defined by margins that are never tested. When those margins shrink, they do not announce themselves. They wait. They require either time or coincidence to become visible. Removing one element from the sequence can restore the margin without ever revealing how close it came to disappearing. The flight had done exactly that. Years later, the aircraft would be retired quietly, its final landing logged like all the others. The captain would advance through training roles, telling new pilots to trust procedures, respect data, and remain alert to what instruments might not say directly. He would never describe that specific flight in detail. There was no lesson that fit neatly into a checklist. In safety briefings, the event would appear only as an anonymized reference, stripped of context and emotion. A decision point, an outcome, a mitigation. Its value lay in how little drama it contained. The aviation system prefers such outcomes. They confirmed that the layers worked, that a potential hazard was absorbed without consequence, that no one had to learn the hard way. The flight that turned back never gained a name. It did not become a case study taught widely. It did not inspire headlines or documentaries. It existed only in records, memories, and incremental improvements. That is how most meaningful safety events end. Not with relief because no danger was ever felt. Not with gratitude because no hero was ever identified. But with continuity, flights continuing, systems improving, risks diminishing slightly, quietly, because someone chose to act before certainty arrived. From the outside, nothing changed. From the inside, the system became marginally safer than it had been the day before. And for the hundreds of passengers who never knew what had been interrupted, that quiet difference was the only outcome that mattered.